1:30, so we'll get started. Still a little bit high. I think that's probably good. Okay. If this is too loud or too echoey, let me know and I can adjust the volume. But I'm just trying to make sure it's a good pickup for Zoom folks. So I want to pick up where we left off last time, and I also want to just kind of maybe also hear about maybe some of your experiences. I think last time we really kind of went into deep on some of the directions that you might want to go. We talked about some of the kind of, what I would say, like the pillars of memoir writing, storytelling, and that kind of leads you into some of those directions. So just thinking about what we did last time was introducing you to prompt engineering, right? So that the higher quality of your prompting to the AI, the more detail you provide, then the better output that you get. We lightly introduced NotebookLM as a writing research assistant. I'm going to go into more detail about that now. Now that I've got a collection of short memoir artifacts that I can be putting in as a good resource for it to do some of the work that I think it thrives on. So we'll look at that. Why guidance helps. So you can use a tool like this to reduce this kind of blank page pressure. If you're kind of getting writer's block, you can utilize it to start asking you kind of questions, getting you going with a basic writing exercise. As I'm looking into the AI and higher ed space, which is highly contentious, about how do we introduce students to AI, the idea of writing exercises so that students are getting more familiar with writing and feeling more comfortable with writing themselves will help them win or help really steer them away from just having AI generate output. Hopefully you saw some of that yourself in this experience of the output that it's producing maybe being a little bit more generic than you would have, or it not being necessarily in your voice, that hopefully you now know what it is good with and what it isn't good for when it comes to writing itself. So the memoir craft moves with the AI prompt. So as you're sharing, it's adapting to what you're sharing to ask the correct follow-up questions. That's really helpful. If I was to get, say, a memoir writing book, it's going to be static, right? It's going to kind of give me some best practices and what that author thinks is the kind of structured approach and the types of follow-up questions that you might have. But if I suddenly take a right-hand turn, thinking maybe about a little bit that last example I'm giving about introducing something kind of mythologically based, like the Three Fates or something like that, and then suddenly now I'm in a whole new context window that the AI can adapt to and ask follow-up questions that are in that context that a book about memoir writing might not be able to just do in the moment as you're in that creative process. So we talked a little bit about scene building, setting senses, stage directions. I'm really curious if anybody engaged with some of that stuff and what kind of output you were getting and how you felt about some of that output. And then looking at deepening the meaning. So what were the values that you had that were tested within your stories or your experiences? The then versus the now. Were you able to engage with it in a way where you're sharing something, but in the framing of the then versus now, that you're getting questions about how it relates to your current life? I'm going to go a little bit deeper into that space as well. I've been talking with some folks about the third act. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that concept, but we'll talk a little bit about that as another theme. And then just the overall idea of themes with a memoir lens. And then the last part, which is kind of the take home that I'll kind of hit a couple more times today, which is this revision choices that keep it you, right? That this class is not about having AI write your memoirs. And hopefully you've discovered that, right? That the importance is your voice. Like that is really your story. And that the tool is to help you with getting your voice out onto paper, rather than it revising and producing something that's more average or more generic than what your individual unique lived story actually is. So using a tool like this for preserving your phrasing and stance. So you'll notice maybe some of the follow-up prompts that I'm having it do when it's generating summaries is keep my words whenever possible, using first person so that it's keeping my framing, my words, my voice whenever possible. But looking at AI for options, so if you're looking to branch in different directions, or you're using it in brainstorming or mapping notes into chapter structure, we kind of talked a little bit about that last time.
Good question.
Yes.
Do you use your tool to not actually have AI write at all, but just to prompt and to make suggestions and all that?
Absolutely. So the way that it's structured, especially in the voice mode, is to just ask one single follow-up question at a time. And then the voice mode, because of it's trying to like reduce like the fatigue of you listening to an AI produce a summary, the summaries that it produces after every 3 or 4 interactions are much more concise, and you can just, but it'll still ask you a follow-up question about where do you want to go from here? Would you want to expand on this? And then you can continue engaging with it in that way. And the thing about voice mode is still getting a transcription of everything that you're saying. So you've got that voice-based narrative on paper transcribed for you to take, just extract that out, ignore any of the actual questions that are being implemented, and then you've got a transcript of your story exactly as you stated it, right?
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, and I think in terms of the non-voice mode, same thing. It's asking like 3 questions, and it's asking like the direction you want to take it based on whatever prompt maybe you put at the beginning. And that's a lot of what I've been doing is, yes, the custom GPT has an instruction set about this is a memoir writing tool, do this, don't do that. But I've also been front loading the tool itself with very specific things, which is where we were getting into some of the themes and the chapter grading and all of those kind of memoir specific concepts to kind of give proof of concept that you can use this in each of these different parts of the memoir writing experience. Okay. So I have a couple kind of questions that I want to explore with you. So for those that have used the tool, for those that have used AI now in this process of memoir writing, what's changed, right? So what did AI make easier? What did it make harder? Where did your voice get clearer and where did it blur? Where did it start to get kind of washed out by the AI itself? And then was there anything that surprised you emotionally about working in this way, as opposed to either working with another person or working solo in the vacuum of not having an assistant, even if there's a visual system along the way? Anybody want to share their experience? Yeah.
Yeah, I was looking at a blizzard that my roommate got caught out in the northern part of New York State. And it was incredibly helpful to describe the conditions and the depth of snow and who were the responders to the search. And it listed different newspapers that I could get first person accounts from. So it was like right on. I wasn't feeding it. I was just asking it, and it was able to dig in.
In which platform or which tool were you using for that?
In that particular one, I was using Claude.
Claude, okay, great. Yeah, so Claude, access to the internet, be able to search out, find up-to-date relevant information and summarize it in a way that's what you needed. Yes.
I took an ancestry journey to England and France this fall, and I discovered that I had a great-grandfather 13 generations back that was a priest in England, a Roman Catholic priest in England. So I had a lot of questions about how did that occur in this particular village in England, and I got a great deal of help from AI in explaining how that might have occurred. That I would have a grandfather that was a Roman celibate, not so celibate Roman Catholic priest. And so that's just one example how I've used it. But it was extremely helpful in that journey. And as I went, I would ask different questions and interact with it.
And one thing that you said really resonates with me, which is this kind of potential, right? That it is formulating a narrative of an option of what might have happened, right? In the absence of the actual evidence, the actual information, and it may have been able to pull information and pull evidence that would have been helpful, but you said very clearly, like, this is still something that needs to have the human in the loop, the fact checking, but it's very helpful at giving at least a concept of thematically, historically, what may have happened to occur to get from point A to point B. Yes.
We have an annual Oscar party And so I tapped that in and said, we have these 14 people, a little bit about them, and I'd like you to create a menu that reflects the movies that we're gonna be watching.
That's great.
And and then I plugged some part in. I said, well, a couple of our people are vegan. And so then they would come back and say, well, you could do this, but leave the feta out. And I mean, it was great.
Great. Great. Anybody else? Anything in particular in memoir writing? Okay.
It's simple, but when I put in some prompts, like I use my cards and I put in some information, I was surprised that they told me that it said that I found a certain information through the census. And I'm like, chat, did I just, no, I'm just using the information you just gave me. But it was true, that's where I found that information.
Right. And so, yeah, and then a couple things about that too, is that one thing you got to remember is that AI has a lot of capabilities about where it pulls information from. So it has been trained on the internet. It's been trained on large, vast amounts of documentation. And so it, at some point, probably scraped the census website and it has that in its internal database structure, right? And that's separate from it actually going out to the internet live and searching up a website and reading the content of a website in that moment too. And so I think we shared last time about in the thinking models, how you can kind of drop down and watch the reasoning process, and that reasoning process can help. Like, how did it come up with this, right? So I think that's a good experience to share. Yeah. All right. Anyone else? Okay. We left off last time with the three fates, and so I want to jump right back in. I'm not going to spend too much time recounting what the kind of underlying history and structure of the three fates is. We did that last time. I just want to jump into maybe the examples. And the whole point here is that I'm choosing a very rich archetype theme to explore memoir writing in to help with that kind of overarching arc of story, right? And so I think this is about where we left off last time, which is, okay, well, can the three fates reflect the individual? So yes, we use the three fates in this mythological setting, and the three fates are describing humanity in a way, but can we then bring it to the individual person? So instead of these external gods, what if they are phases of life? They're psychological forces, they're relational dynamics. And AI can help us explore multiple interpretations of a single symbolic framework like the three fates. So that was the journey that I went down is, okay, well, is there a way to personalize the concept of the three fates to that of the individual human experience? And I'll show you what I got from that prompt. So again, I'm sharing this so that if you had your own kind of concept or structure that you wanted to explore, you can actually have the AI help you in that exploration. Oh, that's difficult of doing it that way. Okay, so of course, because we are dealing with the memoir writing tool itself, it's very complimentary, it's very kind of engaging. So that's such a thoughtful question. It feels like you're reaching for something symbolically and deeply personal at the same time because it's trying to engage me in the process of memoir writing along the way. And yes, it's saying that we can. And so it starts producing what that structure might look like. right? The spinner, the measure, the cutter. It can represent your beginnings, the force that shaped you before you had much to say. So it can be family, culture, circumstances of birth, the traits and tendencies you were given. That was kind of an underlying property. The measure might symbolize your choices, how you shaped your thread through decisions, relationship, risks, turning points, where character and agency live. And then the cutter could not just reflect death, but transformation. So the endings that redefined you, losses, departures, illnesses, changes of identity. I think in a lot of the examples that I've been sharing with you, it's about like transitions, right? Transition from high school to college, transition from Humboldt back down here, right? So I could be framing each of those transitions in this idea of a transformation or a departure, closing and opening a chapter, right? Others interpret them as chance, choice, and time, right? So you could have these three kind of interwoven concepts of the things that happen to us, what we do with the things that happen to us, and then time, so what's humbling us through the process. So you can interweave these three fates in a number of ways. And this tool can help you with trying to do some of that. And then it's kind of getting you into that writing prompt exposure, right? So the child you were, the adult you became the elder who now reflects on it all, right? And so there's a lot of approaches. And then it's like, I'm curious, when you think of the three fates, do they feel comforting, inevitable, restrictive, or inspiring? What draws you to that image? Like, it's asking me, like, why are you landing on the three fates and where are you going with it? Okay. All right. I'll figure out how to get it. So here's my answer to that question. It's like, okay, well, if we're talking about the three fates and they're historically kind of represented as these kind of three women figures in there, maybe it's this kind of relational example of the three feminine influences across a life. And so a man may experience three distinct relational forces, one who helps him build or begin, one who shares responsibility or sustains life, one who accompanies him into aging or truth. And I think the important part about this is it's not literal categories or partners or individual people necessarily. They can represent different functions of that relationship serve at different times, right? I'm just choosing this kind of feminine relational element of it, which may kind of, as this AI generated image produced based on this context, is maybe it's your mother, maybe it's your partner, maybe it's your child, right? Something along those lines. But it could be the matriarchs in your family across your history. It could be those that have been a motherly figure or who have helped bring you into different transitional periods of your life. It could be the number of partners, colleagues, friends that have supported you and that you've had changes in life experiences with through your time. And then maybe it's the youth, it's the people that you have like shared experiences with, those that have now this kind of future generation that's educating you on things that are happening in the world that you were slowly kind of I don't want to say abandoning, but that is moving on in its own direction, not necessarily your personal direction at that point, right? This third act piece, which I'll kind of touch on a little bit. Any questions there? Okay.
I have one question.
Yes.
If this were a different cultural entity who is a person, man or woman, who is making these queries,
Right.
would the image look different?
Absolutely, right. Now you gotta see that the path that I took, so that prompt that I first showed, that was kind of individualizing the three fates and asked me that question at the end, like, where are you going with this? What brings you to this three fates? And I saw in there this kind of relational one. And so I kind of stumbled onto this. I'll show it to you, but like I chose it because it knows that I'm a man. And so it's going down that path in that way, right? But if it knows more about me, because I've given it more context about who I am and where I'm going with this, then it could change the framing of it. Now, back to what I said in week 1 about AI image generation, right? And the bias behind it. It is likely that if I'm talking about a Greek Eurocentric mythological structure, that if I'm asking about it generating images related to that concept, I'm gonna end up with Eurocentric image output, right? So yeah, definitely worth considering that, right? So this one is a little bit of a bigger prompt, and I'm wanting to share this just to give you a sense of like, you have this custom GPT, and that custom GPT is designed around the process of memoir writing and supporting you in memoir writing by asking follow-up questions, being engaging, being empathetic, asking you to kind of delve into memoir writing tropes, and producing summaries along the way to try to help with information gathering. And as long as, and then because if you end up with a digital copy of these slides, that's an active hot link, and as long as you've got a Gmail account, you can get access to this document because it's living. But this is like that next layer, right? So it's like now I'm in the memoir writing app, and I'm saying, now let's introduce the 3 fates, but lived relational experiences instead of literal figures. We're talking about feminine forces that shaped development as a man. Let me kind of increase the font size on this. All right, I think that's good. So the feminine that initiates or calls forth, the feminine that sustains or interweaves, the feminine that reveals truth or accompanies aging. Again, not categories, not specific partners, archetypal functions, relational energies that appear in different forms across my life. Please guide me slowly and reflectively, one question at a time, helping me explore when I first felt called into becoming by feminine presence. First fate. How the sustaining feminine shaped my sense of responsibility, partnership, and shared life. When the feminine became a mirror of truth, limitation, vulnerability, or aging, how these forces changed over time. Again, here are the kind of questions to ask me to be in that framing of that archeological 3 fates type as it relates to relational interactions, particularly framed in the feminine, right? That's this kind of very detailed structure prompting that I'm giving it to have that experience of the storytelling arc to develop. Yeah.
So if you were writing, would you ask this prompt and then like write for 3 weeks before you prompted it again, or
So
writing out all this stuff? And is this like the big chunk you're starting with?
So this would be like the beginning of me exploring this archetype trope in my narrative, right? And then because the memoir writing tool has an outerlying function that says after some number of interactions, some amount of content, go ahead and produce a summary. Then I've got like what I would consider to be the beginnings of a chapter, right? The beginnings of a single story that's framed in that way. And I would probably stop there. And there's a couple reasons why I would stop there. One is the context window. So this thing, as you're interacting with it, it's growing the context window, right? We talked about the transformer, its predictive nature is constantly changing by each thing that you add to the context, right? So now what have we got? We've got the prompt for the memoir writing tool in the context window. We've got this prompt in the context window, and then we have my interactions with it in a chat field as a context window. When that fills up, then you're more prone to generalization, hallucination, context slipping, it going away from the actual initial content that I put in. So that's one reason why I abandon it. And I just say, get a copy, drop it into a document, and then that's where I can do what I was doing last time, which is take this story and let's continue it, right? And now I'm in a fresh context window, and now that summary that I've got is my context, and then I can grow that story out. Say, here's the story where I'm at so far. Let's flesh out some more details. Let's add sensory. Let's add this story arc, let's add the then, now, why kind of structure to it, and then build. Do that for, again, another 15, 20, 45 minutes till you've got some content. Extract that out, bring it back into a new chat list down the road. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so
Okay.
are you actually writing in the app or you're writing in a document and putting it back with that?
I'm copy pasting things out of the chat output into a document. I'll share that in a little bit when we do NotebookLM. Because I've got, just from teaching this class now, I've probably got about 10 pages of like little story segments that I've been collecting that help as the structure that I can continue to build on if I wanted to. Yeah. Okay. So that's the prompt. And just to kind of go a little further with this, to show you the direction that I went with it. Generating a little bit more, right? So I'm still holding the structure of the three fates, but now I'm saying things like, okay, well, how could I use the three fates and introduce conflict as the narrative, the storytelling narrative that I want? Conflict is a great part of the storytelling, and how can I can keep that theme of the three fates, but now be talking about storytelling? Well, maybe it's between the three fates, right? The becoming versus stability, maintenance versus truth, possibility versus mortality. Between the man and each force, fear of growth, resistance to constraint, denial of endings. When one force dominates, perpetual adolescence, lifeless stability, nihilism, right? These are all things that in the framing of the three fates that the AI is suggesting to me as storytelling arcs and narratives that I might want to explore, to Ken, interweave those three fates into the narrative that I'm structuring. Okay. And then to kind of go back to the three fates, this idea of reflection to the memoir framework is now we can get some kind of very specific kinds of prompts questions that I could be being asked in that framing. So with Clotho, the lives I began, who invited me into new versions of myself? Where did I confuse movement with growth? The lives I sustained, where did responsibility define me? What compromises shaped my life? And then the lives I ended, what endings did I resist? What did loss teach me? These are all amazing writing prompts, right? And now they're being tied into this three fates structure that can help me with a storytelling arc, if that's the one that I'm choosing to work in, right? Okay. I want to go back to NotebookLM, and the reason why is that I said early on that if I was to teach this class again, I would likely be using NotebookLM much more than the custom GPT that I wrote. And I want to give you kind of some context of why I feel that way. So with NotebookLM, again, my goal is to kind of maybe use my memoir fragments to generate direction, not just summaries. Because NotebookLM on its surface is like a document summarization, right? Take these documents that have some thematic connection to them and give me a summary of those things. But that's just very, very surface level. And that's not really what we want to be doing with AI. So the first thing that I'll show you and share with you is this critique podcast. So I shared last time, it can generate different types of new educational resources for you. And one of them is generating podcasts. And so there's a critique podcast version, and I'm giving a custom prompt that's going to help me with asking what's missing from my writing. It's going to flag where the voice is feeling surface level or it reads like a timeline, and then also suggesting revisions for authenticity and momentum. So now I've got some critics, right? I've got people that are going to rip me apart.
So you're saying this is the prompt you gave NotebookLM.
This is the prompt I gave NotebookLM, right? And we'll listen to a little bit of this so you can get a sense of what this thing did. So to just give you a sense of what it is, I came to NotebookLM. I added a new notebook. I added the sources. I added my 8-page memoir notes. And just give a quick look at what that is. I can click on the actual tool itself, and you can see all these little subchapters. And these are all things that I generated using the memoir writing tool. And there's all these kind of sub stories that I built in. Many of them I've already shared in this class, right? So 8 pages of those. And then the first thing it did was just give me the summary of it, which is fine. It's not that, that helpful because it's just a summarization. Maybe some of the bold part is kind of helpful in identifying like themes or concepts or things like that. But then you have the ability to ask questions of the documents themselves. So the first thing I tried is, okay, well, how might, let me increase the font size on this one. Close that down. How might I anchor these career and academic moves in visceral internal reflections? So how can I make this thing sound more personal and not like a timeline? I can just ask questions that are like that. Okay, so the anchor your career and academic moves, you can look into the specific sensory memories and emotional tensions documented in your history, moving beyond what you did and why it felt necessary and how it felt to have at those moments, right? So it's going now into the details. I'm identifying as a 3rd-generation math professor. It's not just a professional choice. It's anchored in the quiet choreography of my grandparents' home that was discussed. The reflection, when I think of my academic work, recall the soft clicking of chess pieces in my grandfather's den and the steady rhythm of a home where work and rest were balanced with devotion and duty. Right? There's more opportunities to expand in this space that it's providing me, and it's referencing elements of my writing as to where those prompts are coming from, right? The EdTech transition as fluid adaptability. Inclusivity is a gentler balance. Global perspectives and the irony under the bridge, right? Telling a story about experience I had at 12 in Norway, right? Like it's saying I can go into that space. Okay, so then what did I do? Well, okay, I did this critique piece. And so I think it is this one here. And that prompt that I shared is the prompt that I added. I'll show you what it looks like here, just so you get a sense. I have this audio overview. And so deep dive, that's this kind of very generic NPR style back and forth where they're just kind of delving into a topic, right? So that wouldn't really seem, I think this is like a summarization feature, right? This is kind of a nice, kind of, if you want to digest some information in an audio format with 2 people talking, I say people, 2 AIs talking, then deep dive, right? Then there's brief, right? So if I want a smaller condensed, maybe that kind of news bite feature that you get at the tail end of the hour, that's something kind of like that. And then these are the ones that I think for memoir writing are really interesting, right? A critique, an expert review of your sources offering constructive feedback to help you improve your material. A thoughtful debate between 2 hosts illuminating different perspectives on your sources, right? So I could have this intellectual versus emotional, right? I could have those be the 2 debaters and debating the writing over those 2 different perspectives. And so this is where I put that custom prompt in. And I'll just give you a little bit of a sense of, now it will take time. Like this thing can take about 20 minutes sometimes to produce the actual output. But once you do have it, then it's there. And so here's what that sounds like.
Second, we highlighted the profound necessity of
Notice?
yeah, yeah. That's exactly where I wanted to start too, because I was wondering how heavily this impacts the authenticity of the memoir voice itself.
And all the way to overhauling a university's mathematics curriculum during a global pandemic.
Which is a massive trajectory.
It is, but the catch is
The
that
argument here is that the author's lifelong pattern of adaptability is supposed to be the focal point, and the milestones, they're presented clearly, but the reader is left wanting more of the internal experience.
exactly. We get the logistical facts of survival and adaptation, but we are shielded from the internal cost of those adaptations. When an author relies on surface-level summaries of college timelines, or learning management system adoptions, or changing job titles, without tethering them to the internal emotional landscape, the authenticity of the voice just gets lost. It becomes a timeline of events rather than a lived human experience.
I can see what you're going for here. Let's look at how we can strengthen this. To fix this, the author really needs to anchor these career and academic moves in visceral, internal reflections.
Yeah.
We want to shift away from merely reporting what happened and move deeply into exploring how it genuinely felt to experience these shifts in real time. Because a memoir thrives when the external timeline serves merely as the scaffolding for the internal evolution.
I couldn't agree more. Let's take the transition to higher education. Instead of the narrator simply stating, "College at 16 didn't feel like a grand adventure, just a natural shift," the author needs to put us in the room.
Right. Give us the physical sensation.
Exactly. Describe the physical sensation of that specific, unique isolation.
Okay, so you get a sense of how this could be useful to have somebody critiquing your work, giving you suggestions based on that custom prompting that's there, but in a voice, right? Not just some written format that's there, and having these two different voices engaging in that. Now, the second one I want to share with you is this report mode. And this is a place where I think the improvements to NotebookLM are really, really valuable, especially for something niche like memoir writing. Is that historically the report mode was static, and it said, do you want a document brief? Do you want a study guide? Do you want a FAQ, right? Those were the provided options. But now they've got a mode that will auto-populate AI suggested report types. And this is what it landed on itself. So it got to this place, and I'll show you what it looks like, but this is the prompt that it suggested to me, which was identify and contrast the intellectual legacies of the author's family members, from the father's pioneering work in laser software to the grandfather's role in history and grandfather's roles in history and mathematics. The goal is to help a learner understand how different fields of study, electronics, history, math, and education overlap, and how family patterns of discipline and the life of the mind are passed down through generations, even when faced with personal tragedy. Not the approach I was taking, right? Like I was going the three fates. I'm talking about the women in my life. I'm talking about, and this was like, went very much into this like educational pursuit and this kind of genealogy of education as the storytelling arc. And I'll show you what that looks like.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So in this, I mean, it sounds very, what is that? The language that I'm reading or hearing and saying very academic sounding,
Right.
but is that because you set it up that way? Because, you know, what I would be looking personally would be more of a folksy conversation that had less of that kind of academic feel to it.
This is the one I chose. Let me actually show you what that menu option looks like in NotebookLM itself. Right, so here's reports. And so, like I was saying, these are this kind of briefing doc, study guide, blog post. Those are the kind of pre-generated ones. But each of these pencil marks lets you kind of modify it and personalize those styles of reports. And then there's this kind of create your own. But then here's the suggested format, right? So this was institutional strategy framework, program evaluation framework, cultural comparison profile, thematic concept analysis. So yeah, academic jargony, because this is really, I think, an educational tool, but I think it still landed on something that was very much rooted in this kind of memoir writing. And let me show you what that report looks like, because I think there's some very telling things in there that could be helpful with the process.
Second, Second, we highlighted the profound
So biographical comparison study, 3 generations in the life of the mind. So here's this kind of introduction piece, right? Who the players are, what were they individually doing? First generation scholars of history and logic, my grandfather on my mother's side, my grandfather on my father's side, and then there's this kind of like comparison structure, right? So tools of thought, legacy partner, daily routine. So while my grandfather on my mother's side, office is stacked with banker boxes of research. My grandfather's was this sanctuary den with a leather rocking chair and math posters, right? So there's this comparison and contrasting that's happening between those different elements of those characters. Second generation, my father talking about electronics and the mastery of mind, innovation as a social experiment, and then me, this kind of resilience and the transition into ed tech. And so I thought this was really, and I shared this with my boss, right? The author's work at the Center for Teaching Education synthesizes the family lineage. It combines the technical mastery of the video tools my dad was working with, the educational devotion of my grandfathers, and then, but I've evolved it a step further into remediation reform, focusing on dismantling systemic and structural, right? So like, it's got this narrative that I wouldn't have come up with. And if I chose to take that story arc, it's there for me to write with, right? Not necessarily use it. I'm not gonna just take that because it's, like you said,
Okay.
very academic.
Yeah, so, because I could see how that could also lead somebody down the rabbit hole, you know, and you could wind up going a whole different direction. So you're going down this way and you realize, hey, you know what, this doesn't sound like me. This isn't who I am. This isn't where I'm trying to go. How do you then redirect that back to?
Well, okay, so what I did really like, what turned me on to this particular report was, oh, you were taking a 3-generational biographical approach. And while and I'll go back to the original prompt now. And so while it was very specific about going into my father's work pioneering laser software and my grandfather's role as in history and mathematics, I might say, oh, you know what I really liked about that was just my grandfather's kind of educational pursuits and my dad's kind of, I would say probably not so specific as this, but maybe his work in electronics and technology, right? So I would soften what the specifics are. And then the goal is to help a learner understand how different fields of study overlap and how family patterns. So maybe I don't care about the overlap piece. That wasn't valuable to me, but how family patterns of discipline and life of the mind, that's a very specific terminology I probably wouldn't be using. I probably would use something that's more about the disconnect of the intellectual from other elements of society, such as emotional growth and family experiences and how that was shaped into generational pattern of behavior, right? That might be what, and where does the author end up landing emotionally as a result of the pattern behavior of intellectualism in his prior generations? I would probably do that with this, right? Does that help?
Well, so I guess what I'm saying, hearing you say is, so you would have to redirect this to the direction you want to go, because it's going to take you down this, it's going to suggest these paths, but that may not be the path that, you know, maybe I want to go in my story. So I'd have to redirect the.
That's right. And what I think is nice about this report feature is that this is a great introduction to what a good prompt would be to generate something of that type, right? And now I can craft my own prompts and engineer my own prompts that are thematically different, but are similar in terms of the amount of context and detail that are being provided to get something similar, but more personalized.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Okay. I want to show you, I think, which is, again, going back to this whole thing, is this is not about using AI for writing. This is not about AI writing for you. This is that you will, it's very easy to offload learning, to offload labor onto a machine, and the result that you get by offloading that labor is what you deserve to get from offloading that labor in that way. So I'll tell you a quick example of this. I came up with an idea for a screenplay, a story, and the idea is you've got a female comic who's being rejected by the local comedy scene, and they can't get a slot, and they're kind of battling this trope that women aren't funny, and so they end up walking by like a speed dating event, and they go in there and they just use all of their kind of stand-up material in these 3-minute segments while speed dating. And I thought that would be such a cool, like, visual thing to see, right? And I'm thinking like about like if you've ever seen the Adam Sandler movie Funny People, which is about stand-up comics, and there's like, some very internalized like how the stand-up comedy community interacts with each other in terms of writing and getting gigs, and there is that kind of like women aren't funny trope that kind of gets kind of discussed. And then there's like the Queen's Gambit, right? With that like internal dialogue and that very like visual way of how patterns are being seen in the chess kind of mind, right? So I thought about some of that like narrative overlay that's happening of the stand-up comedian thinking through their jokes in real time while in this 3-minute speed dating. So this very kind of high, fast pace, that's the concept, right? And so I was like, let's see what AI comes up with, right? And so I start putting some of that stuff in, and I don't know a lot about screenplay. I've done a little bit of playing around with AI and screenplay writing, just with some other concepts that I've got. And so this is what came out, right? So working title, Killing at Table 5. I like it. That's okay. But it's just a title. The log line. But I don't know what a log line is, but maybe it's something related to screenplays. A sharp but sidelined female stand-up comic, tired of being told women aren't funny, turns to speed dating events to test new material on unsuspecting singles. But when one of them throws off her script, she's forced to decide whether she's performing to be seen or just to be heard. Sounds like the most generic trailer narrative overlay that I've ever heard, right? This is not the film that I'm trying to write at all, right? Core concept summary, your protagonist sees speed dating as an opportunity, many audiences, varied demographics, no bouncers. What starts as a creative workaround turns into a journey of unexpected human connection, awkward misfires, and a slow realization that performing to people isn't the same as connecting with them, right? Nothing about the story that I shared with you was getting into the human connection piece, really, or about the character arc and transition and growth, right? And so it's introducing those because it's read millions of screenplays and it's trying to average out my story into being more like the millions of screenplays that it's read before.
So are you saying in that sense it wasn't helpful?
What I'm saying is I would not be using any of this
Right.
to be helpful, right? And so I did do a little bit more of a dive into it. I started trying to introduce other characters, trying to introduce other interactions. But again, I'm leaving the writing to the AI in this, right? I'm just letting the AI kind of come up with the stuff, and I'm trying to steer it. But I don't think steering it to writing is the right approach. I think instead it's steering you into writing is the right approach. So it came up with Casey Rivera, early 30s, barista day by day, comic by night, dark observational humor, unapologetically feminist with streaks of emotional honesty, right? So like, again, it's pretty generic output here. Grew up idolizing comics like Joan Rivers, Wanda Sykes, Ali Wong, and Maria Bamford. Burned out by open mics full of drunk bros, hacky Tinder jokes, and being told to smile more. After yet another club books a male comic who stole her material, she takes matters into her own hand. These are all very, very like played out concepts that I've seen in films over and over again. She sees a flyer for a speed dating event and jokes to a friend, at least I'd have a captive audience. The friend dares her to try it, right? Not the approach I would have taken for the entry point into into this, right? I was still thinking about that internal narrative that you're hearing the voiceover of their thought process, and they walk by this event, and they're frustrated, and they go in, like, very self-motivated is my character. This one's requiring this dialogue scene and this kind of daring somebody to do something. Okay. I think I want to just pause there, take our break for the next 10 minutes. And just again, just kind of remind you, using this as the example to remind you that this is really about you writing and having AI assist your writing rather than you having AI write for you. And this is a kind of a good example of why I think that's the case. And I'll talk about this one more time when I talk about the conversation I had with my cousin, who's an author and who's published and been exposed more recently a lot to the AI kind of takeover of publication. And so we'll talk about a little bit that in the next part.
So before we take off, just,
Yeah.
so initially we started, you had what, Memoir, Companion 2.5,
Yeah.
but now you're kind of suggesting Google Notebook LM as, I just want to make sure I'm taking that away before I go to break.
Yeah, and so I think they both serve two different purposes. But I think especially in the sense where you've got your writing, you've got your content, Notebook LM is going to be a better tool in that space because you've already done the heavy work. Now it's just a matter of the fine tuning, the exploration, the maybe getting critical feedback, some kind of analysis, like AI-based analysis of your work. And ChatGPT can do that, but that's not what the memoir writing tool was designed for. The memoir writing tool is to produce writing prompts for you and to help you engage and get past writer's block into the writing process itself.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right, 10 minutes. I will see you back here at 3:33. For you.
Join class. Familiar with the singularity engineer?
Pick all these things. It's fine.
Is it related to the concept of AI singularity? That we get to a point where AI's intelligence surpasses that of all humanity.
That's part of it.
Yeah.
Kind of like.
I got for a second. That I'll keep engaging with you with the concept. I just need to not be on recording for this.
Like, I mean, I do
You know, I don't do off-road stuff.
a story, you know, a certain topic. And so
Oh,
like,
I-
I use AI, I'll take
Welcome back, folks.
indigenous groups in Mexico.
Yeah,
I have
one
one
between.
Go to
Cusco Indian.
Horse and all the.
before I transition to the next
San
one, I
Rosa.
did want to.
There's still.
I
know where you-
Yeah.
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 So, one of the Notebook LM features is called a mind map. And mind maps are really nice visualization feature. And so in this, right, there was only that single document. That's the kind of primary memoir of resilience and growth. That's what it's defining this structure as. And then it broke down that structure into early life and family, heritage and travel, education and independence, professional revolution, personal connections. So although what I provided was chronologically ordered, and it was, you know, as the AI podcasters said, that it really still was devoid of kind of this emotional connection. There is some other identifiable structure inside of that document that it identified. And so each one of these also has nested branching below it. And so if I was to go into early life and family, it branches into my father, my mother, my grandparents' refuge. It breaks down into my grandfather, my grandmother, and this kind of concept of stability and routine. Those going to be built in there. If I go into maybe heritage and travel, then it's taking me into this kind of story I have of this Copenhagen layover, this Norway trip, this under the bridge story, and then on the Norway trip, my aunt's wedding, Norwegian traditions, the Storff Snow Island visit, right? So there's underlying nested structure built into the document that is identifying. Yes.
Okay, so I missed where this is coming. Is this notebook?
This is notebook. This is in Notebook LM. Yeah.
Okay, and so you're feeding it?
All I
These
had was,
stories that you're just putting up there, and how do they get, you know, populated in this particular framework?
yes, let me show that. Out of that piece. Just gotta figure out how to collapse this. There you go. Okay, so in Notebook LM, there is, so again, same thing. It's just those 8 pages of notes. It's just that one document of those 8 pages of notes, and there's a mind map right here. And when I clicked on that, that's what it produced.
So Kyle, do you pay for this version of
Notebook LM is entirely free. There is a paid version. The thing that I think the paid version gets you is, I think it maybe gives you more notebooks that you can have. And I've been using Notebook LM since it kind of first came out, and I haven't filled up the number of allotted notebooks. I think it's maybe 100. You could have 100 notebooks. So 100 folders, each with 50 files, with each one of those files being up to 250 pages each, right? So like pretty expansive amount of information that you can store into something like this on the free side. And I think maybe the paid version also maybe allows for 100 documents instead of 50. I think that's the idea. Yes. What's that?
200.
200. Okay, great. Yeah, the paid version allows 200 documents per full notebook.
So if I have 200 pieces written already in my memoir, that can be fed in to Notebook LM.
That's right. Or the model that I was sharing last time, which is you can take those 200, turn them into 50 by combining them together. And then now you got 50 documents, as long as each one of those 50 documents is under 250 pages. Yeah. So yeah, you know, I'm considering, I think the deadline to put in the proposal is tomorrow. I'm considering running this class again, but I really do think that I would shift about half the content into this tool, just because of all of the features. Again, I think in terms of memoir writing, as opposed to other kinds of creative pursuits, maybe the audio overview isn't as insightful unless that you're really trying to get like some audio feedback that you're interested in, or you're wanting to hear narration. But I'll show you before we end today other audio narration elements to some of this. And then, yeah, and again, like, haven't gone into a lot of detail, a lot of some of this, but like, if I was trying to build some marketing materials, maybe I would want something like the slide deck or the infographic. And if I was doing like what I heard today, which is like some ancestral research, then maybe having a data table that's talking about like, if I've got date of birth and date of death, and I've got like, I'm building out a lot of, I want to have something in a data table as part of my research process. I can imagine that's probably a useful feature too.
So if you're getting reports from ancestry.com or whatever you're using, you
Right.
can feed in the data table.
You can feed it in whatever format that Ancestry gives you, and then have it build the data table. So I think a good example is I use something called Genie, I think is the name of our family tree.
ENI.
GENI, yeah. And so now the thing about Genie is that Genie is crowdsourced. So as you kind of reach the back ends of your tree, then if somebody else is working on the back end of their tree and there's a similar name, then say, hey, we got a potential match here. And then you can compare notes between what you know about your ancestor and what they know about their ancestor, and maybe, oh yeah, same location, same date of birth, same year, it's the match. And now your entire branch opens up because of everything that they've contributed in that space. So again, similar to that mind map structure is what Genie produces. And maybe that's hard to digest, right, for as a human, because again, the format's kind of clunky and it's really only helpful about 5-6 generations back, and then it's just unviewable by a human eye at that point. Uploading something like that into an AI tool, I don't know necessarily how it would handle it, but other AI tools will be able to handle it too, because it's primarily just still text based in these little cells on this visual tree, and then say, boom, give me the data table, and now you've got a whole data structure of that information. So again, that's my hope if I do run this class
You
again.
can put photographs in.
You can. It's a little challenging on the way that, again, NotebookLM is always constantly updating all the time. You can train it on websites, and historically, both websites and PDF documents that you'd upload to, it wasn't reading the images. But I think when Nano Banana came out recently, that all changed and it was able to start processing images using the image model. And so, yeah, I think we're at a state now where it's able to actually process the images and understand them. So it can, you can add audio. You can add audio and video too. And with the video, it won't watch the video, but it'll read the transcript, and then it'll be able to use the transcript of the video as part of its digestion. Okay. Now, I really wanted to spend this last week together trying to send you in possible directions in the future to go with a lot of this. And so I really struggled in where do I land with this? Because I think, what is the end of a memoir, really, right? Is it about like death? Is it about, but I don't think about death in terms of like loss as much as I think about, like, you've reached this kind of achievement in your life. And I don't know how your memoir wants to end, right? And it's like, well, what paths do I want to go down? And I had a conversation with a colleague of mine, and she was really introducing me to this idea of the third act. And so I think I wanted to share it with you because I think it's a really good place if I was trying to say where I am. And I'm not saying me, but in the point in which I am getting close to publish a memoir at the age I expect that I would be when I'm getting to the place to publish a memoir, and I'm dancing around the fact that many of you are older than me and are likely here at the third act, right? And so I'm speaking a little bit outside of my lane when I'm talking about this, but I really resonated with the conversation because I don't think that the end of a memoir is about necessarily the conclusion of a life, right? Like, that's not really what the purpose is. And you can write your memoir at any point, right? Like Gavin Newsom just published his. He's nowhere near.
Michelle Obama.
Right. So that I think though, that this is a really good place that would be including in a memoir, especially for a younger generation, because just like I think we under discuss what postpartum symptoms are, it's just not a part of our general conversation. Those things go underlooked, right? That I think similarly, this concept of a third act, especially around the framing of the third act as a second adolescence, right? I think this is not being discussed in a way that society has a better understanding of it. It's not a television show that I see, like maybe the Golden Girls, right? Maybe the Golden Girls is a good representation of what the third act is, right? The second adolescent. When you try to break down those character archetypes and you see this kind of structure of each one of those characters and the kind of interests of each of those characters and the involvement of those characters with each other, that you really get into this kind of maybe third act, second adolescence. Yeah.
What comes to mind when you say that for me is that whether or not I was 30 or 50 or 80, there's aha moments. Aha, all that stuff that's gone before. Aha, and then what if come from the aha.
Yeah.
Just recognition of realization of what the experience allows future.
Right. And we talked a little bit last week about this in this, what it was, what I felt, and what matters, right? And that's kind of like what matters from this experience that I had and what I was experiencing at that time. What is the value to you, the reader, from this? And I think there's a lot of value in these aha moments, particularly about third act, the second adolescence. And so this where meaning crystallizes, it becomes clear, it becomes a more of a tangible concept. But there's also many experience of renewed identity phase in later adulthood, maybe reinvention, reevaluation, new creative risks, freedom from earlier expectations. I think when my father retired last year, I think he retired at 67. And I've also engaged with a number of colleagues over the years in teaching mathematics that have retired throughout my career, watching folks retire and watching what it takes folks to come to that realization that it's time to retire, and to what it is that comes after retirement, like that transitional period about like, what do you do? Like I talked to my dad last night for about an hour on the phone, and he was talking about how he's slipped into a place of not leaving the house until noon, and how someone who for 30, 40 years of his life was getting up at 3:30, 4:30 in the morning and starting his day by 5 a.m. Is now in a place where he's starting his day by noon, but then staying up until 3:30 at night, right? And that having experiences of, coming in after doing some yard work and then just sitting in a chair and then just napping, right? And there's not this kind of expectation of the job, the timeline, right? That transition that he's experienced, right?
I saw it at Sun City, South Carolina. These are people that retire early. And they go into any kind of frivolous things that they mundane. And an enormous amount of them they get dementia. A lot of my sister's friends have gotten it, and I think it's from just plain boredom and not using your brain.
One of the directions I wanted to take this class is in the direction of memoir writing and engagement with AI as a memory restorative and a memory retention tool, right? That I think a lot of what comes around with things like freedom from earlier expectations, right? So, yeah, I'm outside of my lane here, right? I am just pontificating about what I think this experience may be. But you reach an age, your children are grown, maybe even the grandchildren are at a point now where they're maybe in adolescence. There's like lack of connection familiarly. So you don't have those same responsibilities or family obligations that are there. The expectation of work is gone. So then it is like maybe some creative pursuits, but there's like a lack of structure and direction that comes with it because you're not doing it for an employment feature. And so I think that there's a lot of, there's a possibility of using an AI tool in a structured manner, right? To creating like a kind of a practice, right? Of engaging with technology that can keep your mind going, right? My grandfather's in his 90s and he's still writing and he's still, researching. And I think all of that helps with memory retention. And there's moments where I've had conversations where he's forgotten very certain things. And it's been very like, I can hear the emotional impact that he's experiencing, struggling to pull a memory or like struggling to know that memory is lost and he needs some support in getting that memory back, right? But that he is actively doing these things that stimulate his mind to help with the retention of memory.
Well, I think it's unhealthy to retire too young. I do, from what I've noticed over there.
And again, if that's the case, then are there things for folks that are retiring early to help keep the engagement, keep the mental stimulation? And I think AI could be a tool for that. I don't know how to frame it for an OLLI course specifically, but I think there's something there. And so I'm going to look at this example prompt that kind of ties into this, because I think if this is a kind of storytelling narrative and arc that you want to explore, then it might be helpful to have something in that framing. So I'd like to explore whether the stage of my life might be a kind of third act, perhaps even a second adolescence, a period of reinvention, or renewed identity. That helps the AI know, because there's probably plenty of literature about the concept of a third act and a second adolescence that it can now draw on. So to begin, please ask me how old I am, how I would describe my current life stage, what transition, tension, opportunity, or inner question feels most present for me right now, 2 or 3 roles or identities or expectations that shaped my earlier life. So in this storytelling narrative, I'm giving you this writing prompt in a sense that it's say, okay, this is what I'm thinking about. Here's the questions that I want you to ask me to help frame this kind of pursuit into this third act, second adolescence. And then after I respond, help notice possible themes or patterns that connect who I've been with who I may be becoming. Offer reflective questions that would deepen a memoir exploration of the stage. Suggest one compelling present moment opening image or scene that can help serve as a doorway to a larger life setting. And I like some of this because it's starting to go into the multimodal, which is that like I can start doing some storytelling, I can start doing some sharing, and then in the framing of, I think, if I was reaching this third act, and as I've described it, it's not well documented, it's not well shared amongst people about what that transition looks like, then to have something produce an image framed within this third act transition based on the things that I'm sharing and experiencing, that can be a helpful tool as well at trying to kind of conceptualize what that is. Ideas here?
Freedom from past expectations. I had a colleague, an older colleague, who said that she was reluctant to speak out in classes or in meetings. But she says, now I'm at the age where I just say what's on my mind because I don't give a damn what people think.
Yeah. that makes me think about like what you're talking about is like reflecting back about somebody not feeling comfortable sharing out in class early on. We have an epidemic of that right now with our current student body, right? That a lot of it is pandemic related, but a lot of it is also things like socioeconomic status, equity. There's a lot of issues that are built into that concept of what's happening. When I went to this AI conference a couple weeks ago, I saw a really amazing speaker that was integrating the lived experience of Black and Brown students with AI output. And so I think what we're struggling with as educators is that students are producing generic AI output and not thinking about whether or not that's good or not, and assuming that it's good because it's kind of magical and it looks good and it sounds good because of the generic nature of it. But when you preemptively have the students write personally about their lived experience, so it's still a very personalized process, not the speaking out part that we're getting at, and then produce AI output that's related to the concept. And then there's an ability to contrast this AI output that's really missing the mark of what your lived experience is. That incentivizes you then to share your lived experience more openly, because now you got something to share. Now you got something to say, right? And before, maybe what you had to say wasn't as confident, but now seen in contrast to this AI output than it is. So thanks for sharing that. So then building on that, right? So I can engage with that prompt that I provided, and I can start, I did a little bit of that, just try to speak as a 65-year-old close to retirement. The kind of things that I shared with you is my stereotypical classification of somebody that's approaching their third act. And then what it's providing me as the way to frame this is you can kind of use that present day third act as the anchor. So open in the present. What is it that you're currently experiencing? What is your realization? What is the moment of change that you're kind of focusing on? And then you can revisit the formative past experiences that have got you to where you're at, which if you're doing something like this in a chronological manner, then you can start to tap into those spaces and make those connections along the way. You could take some of your files that you've got as chapter sections and upload those in and say, let's revisit these formative past experiences in the framing of this present day scenario. And then return to the present with deeper understanding. So you're creating this emotional continuity about what you've experienced in the past, what you're experiencing now, and how that either comes to this kind of completion or this movement into the third act. And then the reader orientation. So why this story now, right? So I'm talking about this current event, this current dilemma, frustration that I've got in my life, and why am I focusing on it? Why is it resonating to the surface that I'm wanting to share it in this moment? Well, it's tying back to these past experiences that are there. And then this kind of sense of a life still unfolding, right? That I think this third act, like the telling the story of the transitioning into the third act really offers up this kind of continuity, that it doesn't just end at 65, right? That there's more to the story, there's more to come. Even if you're getting to the closure of your memoir of where you're at, this can help with finding those kind of closing moments, even though it's not the end of your story. Okay. Let me talk a little bit about my cousin and why I'm bringing his conversation that I had with him at 5 o'clock this morning in. Get up and I check Facebook and I see that I have not talked to my cousin about this class at all, which is like, why didn't I call my cousin who is a writer and is published and is active in this space? And I find this Facebook post from him, which let me try to fix this really quick. Okay, I don't know if I'm gonna get it. But, okay, so this is getting cut off on the bottom here, but has anyone used AI to market their books? Tips and suggestions? And so my cousin, and this is particularly in this genre of lit RPG. So let me just quickly describe what lit RPG is. It's a kind of writing genre that I think is best probably represented by, or like in popular culture, by Ready Player One. Maybe you've seen the film, but this idea that you can integrate kind of gameplay or role-playing game elements like hit points, weapons, equipment, things that are kind of tied more traditionally to gaming culture into your storytelling elements. So you have a hero, but the hero gets an equipment, and that equipment has some legacy behind it. You're bringing in those gaming story elements into the literature as well. So my cousin pops in and he says, I'd say don't. So again, this is the concept of particularly using AI for the marketing of books. But if you do, you need to go all in. And I agree with this, right? You have to really learn AI well enough to be successful at using AI for anything, including something like marketing. There are plenty of readers who don't care. So there's plenty of people out there that are happy and content with reading AI generated output. And so, okay, like, AI generated marketing materials in particular. We've seen Super Bowl ads now that are AI generated. And so there was a little bit of controversy early on, right? I think Coca-Cola had a pretty egregiously six-fingered Santa and, things like that. But many readers don't care. Sora videos, AI reading passages over silly videos, those AI generated dramas that he can't seem to block on TikTok. Make sure you're running it as a business. So if you can get income via people watching videos or dramas that you're making money, do the research if you're going to do that. AI or not, I fully recommend having a link tree or something where they can use different options to donate to you. So monetization is really the key here. Yeah, I've been bad and haven't done this myself. Patreon, Substack, or other subscription systems where followers for a price get advanced content and review your AI slot before it comes out. Highly recommend doing that too. When you think about things like a Patreon or a Substack, these kind of subscription systems, these are your fans. These are the people that are invested in you, both financially as well as their time, and they are going to be the honest ones to you. And if you're going to be using AI, they're going to be the ones to tell you to stop, or they're going to be the ones to tell you you've done a good job with it. It's an acceptable use of it, right? You have to love both AI and writing, master both, and work hard. Basically, you'll work 3 jobs. Your in real life job, because writing doesn't pay, writer, and then slot master marketer. And I hope you have the time and energy for it or help. Okay. So saw that, and I said, hey, can we have a conversation and can we talk a little bit about your experience and particularly advice that he would have for this audience? Okay. First is back to what we have been saying all along, right? Which is using AI without losing your memoir voice. So AI's default output trends generic, it averages towards familiar tropes and market formulas. I showed you that with my my screenplay example. We saw it in terms of some of the AI bias and output and imagery. So we've had this conversation, and I just want to keep hitting that home because it does a lot of great things, but it doesn't necessarily do everything great. Okay. Treat AI like a thinking partner. Brainstorming, structure, scene lists, timelines, and what's missing prompts. We saw some of that, right? When I jumped to NotebookLM, I'm asking it, what's missing from this writing? And it's like, gotta put the emotion in there, right? Your revision is where the memoir happens. Rewrite your diction, rhythm, humor, and emotional truth. So again, if you're using AI in that writing process, you still got to go back and do the revisions yourself. Still got to make sure your voice is in there, bring in your wit, your charm, your personality, make sure those things aren't being lost in the process of using AI. And then the big takeaway here, just let AI show you the cliche so you can choose to differentiate or deliberately lean commercial. And I'm adding that here to just say, like, maybe my story isn't marketable, but maybe the story that AI is shifting me towards, right? This idea that maybe it does need to be a dialogue between two folks to introduce that person to go into that comedy club. I'm thinking about, I've heard 2 conversations now with famous actors where the pitch now is shifting to regurgitation of the plot line and the storytelling by dialogue throughout the movie because people are watching movies on their phone. And so they're missing entire scenes as they're sitting there, the movie on. And so they need to hear what's happening because they're not actually watching. So that way they don't miss anything because they're still getting the auditory experience of hearing what's happening. And so you should expect to start to see that stuff being the case with movies that are coming out. And it's unfortunate, right, that's the case. Because for those of us that enjoy cinema, enjoy watching, we don't need to be told what's going on, right? Unless you watched, if anybody's seen The Green Knight, I definitely wish somebody told me what the hell's going on in that movie. I still don't know. So again, there is a possibility that you may want to use some of this output because it does make you more marketable. He wanted to tell you about the different publishing paths that you have. He's explored a lot of these, and these are the kind of the places that he's landed. So you've got traditional publishing, this kind of agent route that you might take. I think there's a lot of opportunity if you were wanting to use AI for the process of finding agents. So he's suggesting, and this is a clickable link when you get the notes. Query Tracker is this kind of way that you can research and track submissions that you're making. And that he's saying Memoir, when he's looking at that list of what's being offered, that Memoir is a huge, it's a very popular genre right now. So it's not a bad time to be getting into it. Submit a query letter. We talked very early on about how you can use AI to shape the tone of an email and shape the voice of the email. And it may be the case that that's what you want to do with the help as part of this part. There's a very particular standard format. So maybe if you're not familiar with what that format is, AI can help you develop what that format is, but it should still be uniquely you because voice matters a lot in Memoir, and those agents are going to be able to sniff that out pretty quickly if you're using AI. I say AI to get your outline of what that standardized part of that letter is, but then abandon it after that and write your own letter that's very personal. The process is pretty much that you submit your query, there's going to be a request for sample pages, maybe, and then that they'll give you the kind of maybe based on that, and then start looking at terms of like, are they going to represent you? And then the agent would be the one that would be selling to the publisher. And part of the problem he says in that is that you're kind of, and we kind of get off into the pros and cons here. Pros here are you get wider distribution, you get access to physical bookstores, and there's credibility that comes with a publishing house. But the trade-offs is there is a much slower timeline. There's many more people involved in the decision-making process. The advance that you might get on the writing process may not be there, or maybe low royalties compared to any of the other pathways that I have here. Like direct sales, that was cut off in the bottom here is direct sales. So the route that he went when he first got started is self-publishing. So direct or wider distribution. So you have direct to, you can create a website. AI is really great at helping build websites now and developing whole structures that you can put into place for market or selling your work yourself. You get wider distribution. You can have things like, I believe Amazon still allows you to self-publish, and now you're on the Amazon marketplace. He recommends services like Ingram Spark can help with the bookstore print channels. So this is kind of like the self publishing, like publishing house direction. But it can be quasi scammy in their business practices. So you have to really, really be careful and research carefully. And that's what he's really trying to lead us to in conversation, was that there's a whole bunch of businesses that are all popping up ever since the kind of the freedom of self-publication was really becoming available. And now when you introduce AI into this kind of like marketplace that's been developed, then you have a lot of opportunity to get kind of ripped off or scammed. And so you really got to be researching carefully. Joining community is a really good way to do that. If you can join writing communities in the genres that you're part of, that can really help with kind of bouncing companies, bouncing distribution models, bouncing concepts off of those folks that have done it. That can help with that place. And writers are pretty good about responding to each other about these kinds of things. So, and then I just put a link here because I just want to give him some credit. This is just a link to the books that he's written. They're all pretty much in that lit RPG genre. And he said, if this audience was this interested in any of his books, that the crafting of chess is probably the kind of the right spot to kind of land in. And a lot of the reviews are saying that this is a really good entry point into the genre of lit RPG. The third is this. And this is, I think, where he's moving in the direction of, like, if he was to do this again, or if he was to do this in the modern era, and if he was to do this with the capacity to navigate a lot of this space, is the serialization, subscription model, your Patreons, your Substacks. Those are also clickable links there to see those. These can be the most reliable pay-wise for some authors, because generally, the fees for using these services is much smaller as opposed to the traditional publication routes, which are much, much more taking the lion's share of the actual sales price. Yes.
You copyright your work.
Yes, and I will make sure before we get out of here, I will talk about copyright and AI. But yes, and I don't have a lot to say about intellectual property, securing your intellectual property, getting your work copyrighted in that space, but I can share a little bit about what you can and can't copyright as a result of the use of AI. So I'll at least touch on that piece. And so a lot of these are really interesting because you're doing things like you're still not necessarily blocking yourself for later agent interest if you hit big. So if you kind of go viral and there's a lot of interest and there's a lot of, you build up a fandom of your own, the agents will be still open to publishing in a more traditional manner because they are wanting to get a piece of that as well, right? And the memoir in particular, thinking about how this might transition to this Patreon Substack structure, is that memoir can work as essays. So you don't have to publish the whole thing in its entirety. You could publish small pieces of this, or themed chapters, or story seasons, or behind the scenes process updates. These are the things that really draw in Patreons and really draw in subscribers, is they get to be a part of the process. They get to be connected more closely to the author by having access and being able to contribute directly to the author. The one that really comes to my mind is one of my favorite writers is Saul Williams. And he's an actor, musician, spoken word, and then also he authors, poetry. And he wanted to do a film based on an album, and he used the Patreon model, and he had structured it in a way that he was going to do a remix album with the soundtrack, and you'd get access to that early. There was, writing credits that were getting put in. There was production credits getting put in. Like, there was lots of opportunities, creating these tiered structures of financial engagement that would also result in some gain by the person who's contributing to be a part of the process. And people are really into that. So the business reality getting back to the kind of AI piece here is that we're talking about AI quality, we're talking about scams, we're talking about getting real help. AI polish that you're doing is detectable, even in the reviews and marketing copy, and can create credibility risk. He actually had to just recently reach out to somebody who'd reviewed to him and ask them to take down the review because it was so clear that it had been AI polished, that he just didn't even want that to be a representation of their experience for his book, right? And ask them to rewrite it. Another space that is kind of becoming more common is AI cover art. I think as we see AI art becoming more kind of acceptable or being more customizable, it's becoming more commonplace and more acceptable by readers. But it could be viewed negatively on the major marketplaces, and also thinking about who's producing it. So like it's often like an add-on feature through the publication process, and they often are outsourcing that and they don't always get it right. They'll just try to do it off of like either your byline or just your title, and you're not going to get a good fair representation if it's not really based on the characters, the plot, the story itself. So if you are going to go that route, you probably either want to do it yourself or work with somebody directly to make sure that the prompts that are being used for those AI images are representative of your work. Be cautious with AI-driven services. So I've got a little bit of experience with other members of my family as this as well, right? But he's going through this with getting his book translated into German, and they're using AI for that German translation process. And so he's basically needing to now find somebody that speaks German well enough, that knows the story well enough, that can then vet the draft that they're coming up with, because it could very well be not a good representation of his book in terms of the translation. I haven't myself seen that. I've been fairly happy with the translation that I've been seeing happening with AI, but again, I haven't looked at it in a creative output as much more as just like an educational documentation process. Other places would be in marketing, hybrid vanity presses. Just be really cautious in that space. Again, people are trying to offload labor, and the process of offloading labor often ends up with not a great result. Expect scam emails after publishing. Fake fans, fake authors, fake marketing agencies. AI has also expanded this because you could be generating fake copy that's very generic historically that you'd written up yourself, and then you're just spamming public or authors with this kind of form lettered email. But now AI is allowing you to like personalize and customize those communications to the author that can seem very real, and oftentimes it's about scamming you out of money or other publication rights and things like that.
Question, some of my work has been published in a book. And it's been on the internet. Can it be copied by AI? People use my paintings and things?
It is very likely that if those things are on the internet in a very public setting, they have been ingested by AI. And while the technology isn't so much that it will produce your work, it is very likely that your work will contribute to the construction of the AI generated work.
So it's out there.
It is very likely, yeah. Now,
without my knowledge.
that is right. And there is a whole open conversation happening on whether or not that constitutes copyright infringement or not. Early on, when the New York Times sued OpenAI because it appeared basically that AI output was coming directly from the New York Times content, OpenAI's legal claim was that this is no different than if I was to read the New York Times to my 3-year-old, and that my 3-year-old then was to recite back to me what I had told it from my reading of it to the New York Times.
Well, the reason I'm asking, because I sued American Ladies Home Journal, American Home Magazine. They copied some of my designs and put it in their magazine. And because it was copywritten, I won the case. But how could I do it today then, in that respect?
we're gonna have to wait and see. So the Supreme Court just recently dodged the take to actually explore this conversation. So we are going to have to wait and see how these things play out in the court. And I think in the meantime, I would be looking out for that type of thing happening for your own content. And following what the legal precedent for you're able to seek anything. But at this point today, I don't have any advice to give you about what you're doing to protect yourself from AI ingesting and regurgitating your content. We've even seen things where watermarks on images that have been ingested by AI, the AI output is still having the watermarks bleeding through in the output. So it's clearly coming from copyrighted material. It's just, what are we going to do about it? Right. Okay. So I have a couple things that are off slide that I want to go through. And the first one is just talking a little bit about so a little bit about copyright. Let me find that.
It's impossible really to have it today, isn't it?
Before I send out the slides, I'll make sure this gets included in the slides as well. So just to kind of give you some quick background about just IP protection overall, right? There are trademarks that you can use that protect your brand. There are patents that can be used to protect your inventions. And there's copyrights that can be used to protect your creative works. And so when it goes to the process of introducing AI into creative output, then, and the courts have been pretty, just in the last couple of months, have been revising what their interpretation of what is it copyrightable regarding AI output. And so the first is that copyright requires a human author. So anything that's purely AI generated output is not copyrightable because US law requires a human creator. Okay. Now, the human control is the deciding factor in arguing for copyright. Your creative edits to an AI image can be protected, but the underlying AI generated parts cannot be copyrighted. Okay. So your creation, so a good element of this is I've seen a lot of AI generated film, like in industry, folks that are doing this in a very creative manner, where they're still going in and they're making large scale edits and changes, human contact changes to the output. And so just thinking about what you're contributing to it and how what your contribution is the underlying thing that you're copywriting and not the baseline image that's there. So I could get an AI generated scene of a landscape with a castle. I can't copyright that. If I go in and I create a hand drawn hot air balloon in that scene, that hot air balloon is copyrightable. And so now if somebody was to copy my balloon, that would be infringement on my copyright. But them producing that same castle-based background image, that would not be a copyright infringement because I didn't create that piece of the creation process. Patents and trademarks have very different rules here. Patents require human conception of the invention, and trademarks can protect AI-generated logos. So there's different definitions of what can and can't be copyrighted depending on the use case that you're looking at. Okay. The next thing I want to share is 11 Labs. And what I'm going to do is I'm gonna grab a chunk of my memoir, and I'll just grab a paragraph just to give you a sense of what this is. And I've introduced some of this previously, but I just want to show you the platform itself with a little more detail and what you can and can't do with this tool. And this tool, I think, is actively evolving too. So when I initially did my first talk a couple years ago on AI deepfakes, that's when I first got introduced to 11 Labs. 11 Labs allows you for the cloning of your voice. And so thinking about next steps, I thought, how great would it be? You've got your memoir and you want to share it. Well, you want to maybe share it with your own voice. So you, without having to go through the painstaking process of creating an audiobook and you narrating your own story, now you can actually just do speech or text to speech. And so what did this do? I had to sit down and talk for they want about 20 minutes. I did about 10. So my AI clone of my voice is not the most optimal. I'm about 2 models out of date. So there's a lot more specific and accurate voice models than what I've done. They also have a number of voices that you can use in their library that's there that you have access to. So if you wanted to generate your own audiobook with one of these voices, you could use one of these voices. If you needed to do a voice overlay, if you're thinking about marketing materials, right? You wanted to produce some sort of an audio segment that's marketing, you have access to a voice to be able to produce that content and not have to pay a voice actor to do that work. But now they've got this instant speech feature that I'm going to demonstrate. There's this audiobook feature that's kind of there. That's like kind of the next iteration of this. Image and video. So now you can actually produce image and video just like many of these other models can. But I think what's nice about this one is that you can also introduce your own specific voices for voice overlays within that image and video creation. And then now we're getting into the future that we've kind of hinted at a little bit here, which is 11 Lab agents. So being able to do like full on workflow processes by using agents, and then the creation of music, because now I've got the clone voice. So now not only am I generating AI music, but I'm generating AI music with my own AI voice being the singer in those AI generated music pieces. So a lot going on here. I'm going to demonstrate the text to speech. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to choose my voice. There's a couple options here about kind of like fine tuning the voice. You'll see this is pretty typical, and some advanced image generation models will have similar types of kind of preset settings that you can do. So do I want the speed to be faster or slower than what the model is designed to read at? I found that I myself speak at a little bit more of a rapid rate. And so I might want to make this a little faster. I'm going to leave it where it's at so you can get a sense of how off it might be, but that's fine tunable, right? That could be faster, it could be slower. Stability, how much like the recorded model itself. Now you got to think about the recorded model was only trained on 10 minutes of my voice. And predominantly the vast majority of the content of that was me reading podcast introductions, like, hey, welcome to the podcast. Today, we're going to be introducing so-and-so, or hey, today we're going to be talking about this, or today we're going to have a very, very candid conversation. It's like lots of different styles of podcast introductions was the predominant amount of the input I gave, because that's what I thought I was going to be using this for mostly, right? I thought it would also do a good job at creating enough variability in my voice that would be good for a good model. So then similarity, how close to mine, how far away from mine, style exaggeration. So if it picks up particular inflections of the recorded quality that the ones I provided, it can lean into those more and exaggerate those more, or it could kind of have none of those there too. So I think I've got a pretty hard Northern California accent built into me, and I could have it be exaggerated if I wanted to. So now all I need to do is I can just in this field paste in my text. So here's a paragraph. And then I can say generate. And
There was a lot of expectation wrapped up in that move. When Courtney decided to move into the place she had chosen, there was an understanding, or at least a hope, that she was moving into a space for both of us, but the space was absolutely hers. From the beginning, there was a very real feeling of expectation that I would conform to her living environment and to the cohabiting dynamics of sharing space. At the same time, I was in a new city. I was trying to find my own way, make my own schedule, meet new friends, and build a new community. I don't think I was ready to be navigating shared expectations while also trying to establish myself.
I'm gonna pause there. So a couple things, right? One, this is just coming out of the notes that I have. And there's a lot of things that are happening here in terms of punctuation that are driving a lot of the way that this is pronouncing itself and how it's doing timing and changes in intervals. And I think that both from the audio output perspective as well as the writing stylistic perspective, then you can see some of those things happening. This is where things like M dashes really start to kind of maybe be something that you might want to consider including when you're producing an audio version of your output. So I just wanted to share that as another tool. And I guess I'm out of time. The last thing I'll just share before we end is just my last slide here. Which is just, I think, where I would like to frame a lot of this is that using AI in lots of elements of your life moving forward comes with both benefits and risk. And so if you're thinking about AI as an organizational tool, as a way of thinking about your story, whether it's Memoir, whether it's some other element, there's things that are low risk and there's things that are high risk. So archiving help, being able to do things like organizing photos, tagging things, summarizing journals, transcribing audio. These feel like very low risk things to do. When you start getting into medium risk, that's what we've been spending some time talking about, turning fragmented notes into timelines, interview question generation, memory prompts for elders, right? You're starting to delve into the space of AI generated content, and there's risks that come along with that in terms of how you use it and how you yourself engage with it. And then getting into high risk, this kind of digital presence, right? And so I could talk a little bit more about this the next time I teach the class, because I'm sure we're going to build into this space. But chatbots that are trained on somebody's own writing and voice, after death messaging, interactive avatars. So there's already, Facebook has made it so that it will post on your behalf after you've passed away. You can sign up for that. And it'll go to your friends' posts and comment and like on those things because it's been trained on years and years of your posting, and it can mimic your social media presence after you've gone. And maybe there's a value to that, right? I've shared with you how you can use AI for memoir writing. And if you've been sharing your stories with AI and you've got a voice clone of your voice, it's very easy to start getting into this kind of after-death messaging space of an AI avatar of yourself, right? Your children can call up and ask you the recipe that they grew up with, and your own voice could be reciting it back from your own notes that you've provided it. So a lot to consider in that space too.
So if we're putting something in to get it feedback on what we wrote, including no problem, then whatever we put in is now in AI, it is no longer private.
I don't want to give that as the take-home message here, because all of these companies have privacy settings and have data security policies, and that's not the intention, right? But if you were to do it with that intent, right, to create, in a sense, a custom GPT that is trained on you, to create a chatbot that is trained on you for the purposes of other people to use, that's a real possibility in this modern age.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You take care. Take another class next semester?
Yeah, I'll take a look at it. It's my first class.
Okay, good.